vulnerability would be, team, this is where I've struggled in the past, or team, this is what I'm struggling with now. And we love to hear that from leaders, but we don't want to hear that on the first day. So I had a leader that opened that way. He had been appointed as an interim executive, and he pulled the team together and he said, team, I got a great announcement. I just got appointed this interim executive. The team then told me he immediately put his head in his hands and started bursting into tears and said, I have no idea what I'm going to do.
Oh, no.
And the team said, we really appreciated his vulnerability, but that was not what we needed in the moment. We needed to know he's got a handle on it, or we're going to get through this together. Now, down the road, if there was struggle and something happened, that might be an appropriate reaction, but we want to save the vulnerability side to a little bit later. This is the Leadership Foundry Podcast. I'm your host this week, Brandon Smith. And our show this week is going to be a little different than our typical Leadership Foundry show. So normally on our Leadership Foundry podcast, what we do is we'll interview a leader and we'll interview her or him, share their stories, learn their leadership lessons. Well, today we asked you, what are some of the big challenges that you all are facing as leaders today? As we round out this year, move into next year, what are some of the biggest leadership struggles, opportunities, things that have been thrown your way that you're wrestling with and you're looking for a little bit of guidance? So to help me on this journey, I have my wonderful producer and colleague, Whitney, joining us today. Whitney, it's been a long time since I've had you on a show.
It has. I'm excited to be back.
I'm really excited to have you on here today.
Yeah.
So I know we've got some questions that have come in through various channels. So maybe we can start with one.
Yes. We'll tackle the first one, which I'm excited to hear you expound upon, because it's with credibility. As an executive, I don't want to damage my credibility. What should I avoid?
So maintaining our credibility as leaders, it is a challenge. It's a challenge today. And what I often see is there are three big subtle things that we as leaders do that cuts into our credibility. So the first one is because we're moving so fast, we think out loud. Ooh. So we're in meetings and we'll just start to say, well, maybe we such and such and such. And we got away with that as managers or directors, but if we're a more senior executive, when we say that, people are going to think we've made a decision. So I was on a fellow podcaster's podcast some years ago, and he was the owner of multiple businesses. And we talked about this. And he shared this one story with me. He said, yeah, we just finished our year. I owned a trucking business. We had vans and other fleets of vehicles. I was giving the town hall, and I said, hey, we had a great year, everybody. So it was such a great year. We should think about maybe even adding a few more vans to our fleet. Just something for us to think about. He said he patted himself on the back, went home, had a great night's sleep, thought that was a great town hall, came in the next day, and then lined up next to his parking space 6 brand new white vans with 6 purchase orders on his desk. So sometimes when we think out loud, it can damage our credibility because we can say something that we may just be thinking, but someone has made that in their mind a decision. The second way we damage our credibility is that sometimes we move too quickly. So we don't consider all the stakeholders that we need to bring into the loop, particularly as an executive. We need to make sure that we're thinking about our peers. And before we make a decision, we're contacting the folks to our left and to our right and say, hey, just so you know, we're going to do this. Is this going to affect you in any way? So speed can be a real danger for us. And we're in a time where speed is important. So we feel pressure to go fast. And the third one is probably the most subtle. And I see executives doing it all the time, and it is a big, big no-no. If you're on a senior meeting or a senior call with the rest of the senior executive team, or a really important call, do not take it in your car, on your phone, on Zoom or Teams. I've had this happen so often, and it immediately damages your credibility.
Yeah.
Because you don't look serious, you don't look like you're honoring the other person's time, or in many cases, the whole other senior executive team's time. It damages your credibility. It's like you're not taking your role and the conversation seriously. So if you can't make it into the office, don't take it in your car. Find a quiet space you can do it. But if you can avoid those 3 things, we can avoid, talking, thinking out loud, avoid moving too quickly without aligning other people, and being really thoughtful about when and where we take video calls. It can help preserve our credibility. But stepping on those 3 can cause us challenges.
Yeah. That's interesting, because I was thinking about with your first story, if I was that particular team member who had aligned those purchase orders and helped get the trucks there, I would probably be upset that I had done some work because I thought those wheels were already in motion. No pun intended there. But okay, if we're an executive and we've already done one of these terrible three, can we repair our credibility?
You can. Depending upon the misstep, you can apologize for it or you can acknowledge the misstep and say, I didn't intend for this to occur this way, or I didn't think about the consequences. But most importantly, make sure you don't do it again.
Okay.
So most of us will give each other grace for the occasional misstep, the occasional video call from their car if it was an emergency situation. But if you're regularly doing any of those three, it will whittle away. So think about it as a bank account. Every time you misstep on one of these, it takes a little bit out of that bank account. But if you keep doing it, pretty soon there's going to be nothing left in the account. And then it's really hard to refill that account.
Yeah.
Because it's not like, well, I do make these missteps and I do the opposite. No, it doesn't work that way. The missteps cost you a lot more than the additions.
Is it similar to rebuilding trust? When you speak about trust, is there a time limit that usually it takes if maybe your credibility's gone to zero?
It does. So if you've damaged your credibility, so when I work with leaders that are trying to rebuild their brand or reputation or credibility, typically takes at minimum 6 months.
Okay.
6 months to repair. But depending upon the damage and depending upon where the other players sit, it can take longer. So when I say where other players sit, let's say you're on a global leadership team and you never see the folks that are in other parts of the world. Okay, well, then it's going to take you longer because you just don't have enough exposure for them to see the change.
Right.
So it can take, in those cases, up to 18 months. Ooh. But that's why it's so important that we're really, really intentional about catching it quickly and repairing it fast. Otherwise, we could have a long road ahead.
Yeah. I love that advice. Okay, you're ready for the second question?
Ready.
I'm a new leader. How can I build trust quickly?
So we talked about trust just a minute ago. And so for those that maybe haven't been exposed to the trust formula that I've been preaching for many years, it's a great starting place. So when we think about trust, think about it as a mathematical equation. So in one side of the equation, it's authenticity plus vulnerability in parentheses. Okay, so you got to add those two up, it's in parentheses. And the amount of that, you multiply that times credibility on the other side of the equation. So this side we have authenticity, vulnerability. This side we have credibility. And why there's a multiplier in the middle is if either side of that equation goes to zero, trust goes to zero. So I can be as authentic and as vulnerable with you all day long, but if I don't have any credibility with you, you're not going to trust me.
Yeah.
And the opposite is also true. I can be as credible, have the greatest title in the world, greatest resume in the world, but if I show up as too plastic or too polished or too phony, you're not going to fully trust me. You're going to think I'm kind of playing politics or playing some kind of game, have a hidden agenda. And so the key is you just can't go to zero on either side. So to the question, if you have a brand new team that you're working with, you already come in with a certain, and you're the leader, you already come in with a certain level of credibility because you were appointed as a leader. Now, we can always improve that, and we improve that through consistency and responsiveness. That's a great way to kind of fill that bank account. But they also need to know a little more about us, because the quicker they understand us, understand our expectations, learn a little bit more about who we are, the quicker that we can build trust with them. So what we want to do is early on with our team, sit down with them and say, hey team, really excited to be here. Let me share with you a little bit about my expectations. Let me share with you a little bit about my values. Let me even share a little bit about my journey, what my journey has been here, and maybe even a little bit about my personal side. It doesn't have to be deep, but just a little bit so they get a sense of who you are as a person. That will help them kind of drop their armor and weapons and feel a little more trusting. Some organizations actually have a formal process for that. They call it a new leader assimilation that HR facilitates.
Yeah.
And they'll actually guide the team and the leaders through that conversation. And it helps what they can do in 3 hours will accelerate trust by about 3 months. So it's a nice way to do it. So while we want to be on this side, make sure we're very responsive, make sure we're really communicative and consistent. Those are all great. But also make sure you're sharing your expectations, your values, a little bit more about who you are. That's going to go a long way to kind of build both sides of that equation and really accelerate trust fast.
Yeah. I've Always love the trust formula. I think it's brilliant, especially where those parentheses fall, right? Because that shows the impact of one piece as it correlates to the other. Can you share like a quick story of what that vulnerability looks like? Because I feel like if we share too much, then that can have a negative impact on credibility.
Yeah, so when we're talking about authenticity and vulnerability, lean a little more early on with authenticity. Okay. We'll save vulnerability for a little later. You don't want to be too vulnerable too early because you want to make sure you've built up so much credibility that when you are vulnerable, people still see you as credible. So authenticity is things like expectations and values and journey. Vulnerability would be, team, this is where I've struggled in the past, or team, this is what I'm struggling with now. And we love to hear that from leaders, but we don't want to hear that on the first day. So I had a leader that opened that way. He'd been appointed as an interim executive, and he pulled the team together and he said, team, I got a great announcement. I just got appointed this interim executive. The team then told me he immediately put his head in his hands and started bursting into tears and said, I have no idea what I'm going to do.
Oh, no.
And the team said, we really appreciated his vulnerability, but that was not what we needed in the moment. We needed to know he's got a handle on it, or we're going to get through this together. Now, down the road, if there was struggle and something happened, that might be an appropriate reaction, but we want to save the vulnerability side to a little bit later.
Right. I love that. That was a great differentiator.